When the WA crossed the line and called the cops claiming my ranch was their property, they expected intimidation to work in their favor. What they didn't expect was that a single, well-prepared meeting would expose their lies, flip the power dynamic, and place the entire WA under my control. This wasn't just about land, it was about authority, truth, and turning arrogance into defeat. The moment the WA claimed my ranch was theirs, I knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a calculated move built on arrogance, intimidation, and the assumption that power comes from noise rather than truth. My ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was the result of years of work, legal ownership, and documented boundaries. Yet the WA chose to ignore all of that and push a narrative that suited their convenience. Their first mistake was believing that repetition could replace legality. They sent notices filled with vague language, referencing community boundaries, and shared development zones, none of which legally applied to my ranch. These notices were written in an authoritative tone, clearly designed to confuse rather than clarify. Most people, when faced with such official-looking documents, hesitate. That hesitation is exactly what the WA relied on. Soon after, the situation escalated. Instead of seeking a lawful resolution or presenting verified records, the WA made a bold and reckless move. They called the police. Their claim was simple but dangerous. My ranch, according to them, was WA property, and I was an unlawful occupier. This wasn't just a lie, it was an attempt to weaponize authority. When the cops arrived, the WA representatives stood with visible confidence. In their minds, the presence of law enforcement was already a victory. They believed uniforms alone would end the discussion. But confidence built on deception is fragile. The officers asked a basic question: who owns this land? The WA had no original deeds, no registered surveys, no legally binding documents, only printed WA maps and internal diagrams that held no legal weight. This is where the false claim began to crack. WA maps are not property deeds. Internal zoning sketches are not government records. But the WA had grown used to bullying residents who didn't know the difference. Their entire system thrived on the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to demand proof. The police, doing their job, quickly realized this was a civil matter. Without legal documentation, they couldn't enforce the HOA's claim. The officers left, but the damage was done, not to me, but to the HOA's credibility. Still, instead of backing off, they doubled down. Behind closed doors, the WA spread their version of the story. They told residents that my ranch fell under legacy WA land, a term that doesn't exist in real estate law. They framed me as incooperative, difficult, and obstructive. This tactic served two purposes: to isolate me socially and to pressure me into compliance. What they underestimated was preparation. I reviewed every document tied to my ranch: the original purchase deed, county records, land surveys, tax receipts, and boundary confirmations. Each one clearly established ownership, zoning, and jurisdiction. The ranch had existed long before the HOA was even formed. Its boundaries were registered, taxed, and recognized by the county, not by a private association with limited authority. The HOA's claim wasn't just false, it was impossible. Yet false claims can be dangerous when repeated loudly enough. The WA relied on volume, intimidation, and bureaucratic confusion. They assumed that if they acted official enough, no one would question them. This is a common WA strategy: blur lines, misuse language, and create urgency so the target doesn't have time to think. They sent follow-up letters threatening fines, access restrictions, and community enforcement actions. None of these threats had legal grounding, but they were designed to exhaust and overwhelm. This is where many property owners give up, not because they're wrong, but because fighting feels too heavy. I chose the opposite approach. Instead of reacting emotionally, I documented everything. Every letter, every email, every false statement. I noted inconsistencies in their claims, contradictions between their bylaws and their actions, and the absence of any legitimate ownership proof. Their false claim wasn't just weak, it was self-destructive. The more they spoke, the more they exposed themselves. Their biggest error was assuming that calling the cops would establish legitimacy. In reality, it did the opposite. Once law enforcement declined to act, the WA lost their strongest intimidation tool. From that moment on, their claim existed only on paper they created themselves. False claims survive in silence. They die under scrutiny. By the time the official meeting was scheduled, the HOA's position was already crumbling. They had no external validation, no legal authority, and no factual basis. All they had left was posture. And posture doesn't hold up in a room where evidence speaks. This false claim, meant to seize control, became the very reason the WA lost it. Because when an organization chooses intimidation over legality, and ego over evidence, it doesn't just fail, it exposes itself. The ranch was never theirs. But their attempt to take it revealed something far more valuable: their limits. Limits I was about to use against them. The meeting that changed everything didn't begin with shouting, threats, or drama. It began with silence, the kind of silence that unsettles people who rely on intimidation. The WA members walked into that room expecting resistance, excuses, maybe even anger. What they found instead was preparation, patience, and absolute control of the facts. From the very start, the atmosphere was tense. The WA board sat together, confident in numbers, convinced that collective authority would outweigh individual ownership. They had rehearsed their narrative. The ranch was within WA influence, the boundaries were unclear, and their previous actions were misunderstood enforcement efforts. Every word was carefully chosen to sound official while saying nothing concrete. I let them speak first. This was intentional. People who lie reveal more when they talk uninterrupted. As each board member repeated the same vague claims, contradictions began to surface. One referenced a map that didn't match another's description. Another cited bylaws that applied only to residential lots, not agricultural land. Their story wasn't unified, it was stitched together. When they finished, I placed a single folder on the table. That folder carried more weight than their entire board. Inside were certified documents, county registered deeds, land surveys stamped by licensed surveyors, tax payment records spanning years, and zoning classifications clearly labeling the ranch as independent property. Each document wasn't just evidence, it was a timeline proving that my ranch existed long before the HOA was even a concept. The shift in the room was immediate. Confidence drained from faces that moments earlier had been smug. The WA president attempted to regain control by questioning interpretation. That was another mistake. Legal documents don't rely on interpretation, they rely on registration, jurisdiction, and law. I walked them through the evidence calmly, point by point. No emotion, no aggression, just clarity. Then came the moment that turned the meeting irreversible. I referenced their own WA bylaws. Buried within their rules was a clause limiting their authority strictly to properties explicitly listed within their recorded jurisdiction. My ranch was not on that list. Worse for them, another clause prohibited the WA from engaging law enforcement in property disputes without verified ownership documentation. They had violated their own rules. This wasn't just about losing a claim, it was about exposing misconduct. As this became clear, board members began turning on each other subtly. Side glances, quiet disagreements. The unity they relied on fractured under pressure. Power structures don't collapse loudly, they crack quietly. Then I addressed the police incident. I didn't accuse. I asked a question. On what legal basis did you involve law enforcement in a civil matter involving property you do not own? No one answered. That silence was louder than any argument. It confirmed recklessness, not authority. At that moment, the narrative shifted. The HOA was no longer the enforcer, they were the liability. I made it clear that I had documented the incident, the false claims, and the threats. I didn't threaten legal action, I outlined the consequences calmly, factually. Regulatory bodies, civil accountability, board responsibility. Fear replaced arrogance. The meeting was no longer about my ranch. It was about their survival as a board. This is where strategy matters most. Instead of pushing for punishment, I offered structure. I proposed a resolution framework, acknowledgement of ownership, written retraction of claims, and revised WA procedures to prevent future overreach. This confused them. They expected retaliation. What they got was leadership. By offering order instead of chaos, I positioned myself not as an opponent, but as the only person in the room who actually understood governance. Authority doesn't come from titles, it comes from competence. One by one, objections faded. Votes shifted. Agreements formed. By the end of the meeting, the WA formally recognized my ranch as independent property. They issued a written statement retracting their claims. More importantly, they restructured enforcement oversight, placing decision-making checks that I now influence directly. Control doesn't always look like ownership. Sometimes it looks like shaping the rules everyone else must follow. That meeting didn't just end a dispute, it rewrote the balance of power. The WA walked in expecting submission. They walked out reorganized, exposed, and restrained. And I walked out knowing something they didn't fully grasp yet. They had lost the moment they underestimated preparation. The real shift in control didn't happen inside the meeting room, it happened after. That's where most people misunderstand power. Power isn't the moment you win an argument, power is what changes when the room empties and the consequences begin to unfold. By the time the HOA members left that meeting, they believed the issue was resolved. What they didn't realize was that the structure they depended on had already changed, quietly and permanently. Before that meeting, the HOA operated on assumption-based authority. They enforced first and justified later. Their power came from confusion, speed, and the fear of residents who didn't want trouble. After the meeting, that system no longer worked. Every decision they made now carried awareness that someone was watching, documenting, and understanding the rules better than they did. That someone was me. The first visible shift happened in communication. HOA notices, once aggressive and vague, suddenly became cautious and specific. Words like immediate enforcement disappeared. Legal references were double-checked. Threatening language vanished. This wasn't courtesy, it was fear of accountability. Control had changed hands. Behind the scenes, board dynamics collapsed further. The president who once spoke with authority now hesitated. Board members began requesting clarification before taking action. Votes that used to pass automatically now stalled. This hesitation wasn't weakness, it was dependency. They no longer trusted their own system. And when a power structure stops trusting itself, it looks for guidance. That guidance came from the framework established in the meeting. The revised enforcement procedures required documented justification, recorded votes, and transparent records. On paper, these changes looked neutral. In reality, they redirected influence. Because I understood the system better than anyone else in that room. I didn't need a title. I didn't need a seat on the board. Control doesn't require visibility, it requires leverage. And leverage comes from knowledge, documentation, and timing. Soon, other residents noticed the change. HOA enforcement slowed. Arbitrary fines stopped. Disputes that once ended in threats now ended in reviews. People began asking questions the HOA struggled to answer. That's when perception shifted. Residents no longer saw the HOA as an untouchable authority. They saw it as a structure bound by rules. And when people stop fearing authority, authority weakens. Quietly, residents started reaching out to me. They asked how the dispute was resolved. What documents mattered. What rights they had. I didn't position myself as a rebel, I positioned myself as a reference. Information spreads faster than intimidation. Every time someone challenged the HOA using facts instead of emotion, the board lost a little more ground. Each challenge forced them to comply with the new procedures. Each compliance reinforced the reality that their power was conditional. The HOA still existed, but it no longer controlled the environment, it reacted to it. This is the stage where most organizations make fatal mistakes. They try to reassert dominance. But this HOA couldn't. Any aggressive move risked exposure, liability, and internal collapse. So they did what weak power structures always do, they adapted to survive. And survival meant surrendering control. The most telling moment came months later during another board meeting. A minor issue arose involving land access near my ranch. Previously, this would have triggered immediate enforcement. Instead, the board deferred. They asked for documentation. They asked for review. They asked for time. They asked me. Not directly, not formally, but through procedural channels I now influenced. That's when it became undeniable. The HOA no longer made unilateral decisions. They followed a system shaped by someone they once tried to overpower. That is total control, not dominance, not ownership, influence. The HOA had become predictable. And predictability is vulnerability. Once you know how an organization must act, you can anticipate, guide, and contain it. Every enforcement action now had limits. Every decision had witnesses. Every mistake had consequences. The board members knew it. They felt it. Their authority was no longer loud, it was cautious. And caution is the opposite of control. What began as a false claim over land ended as a transfer of power. Not through force. Not through lawsuits. Through exposure. The HOA lost control because they revealed how they operated. They showed their methods, their shortcuts, their arrogance. Once exposed, those methods stopped working. Power thrives in darkness. It dies in daylight. By the end, the ranch wasn't just secure, it was untouchable. Any attempt to challenge it would trigger scrutiny far beyond the HOA's capacity. They knew this, so they avoided it entirely. That avoidance was the final confirmation. They didn't fear me. They feared what I represented, accountability. And accountability is the one thing corrupt authority cannot survive. The HOA still collected dues, still held meetings, still enforced minor rules, but the illusion of absolute control was gone. In its place was a system restrained by rules it could no longer bend. The balance had shifted. One meeting exposed a lie. One strategy dismantled authority. And one mistake, their mistake, gave me total control. Not by owning the HOA, but by making sure it could never overstep again.